Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I would like to talk to you about evaluating sources. So, the first thing we have to think about is why we evaluate sources. Now, what we're specifically talking about is if we are going to reference something in a homework or a paper, but we can also use this knowledge to think about the research that we might even do in our personal lives so that when we are looking at and sharing information, we can make sure that we are sharing the best information possible. So, the reason that we want to evaluate our sources is we need to check for things like the validity of the information. Is the source telling me something that's true? Is there a bias to the information? So, bias can actually have a wide range of meanings, but we're not exactly looking for no bias. What we're looking for is more that we know what bias it has so that we can take that into account as we are looking at our sources. We want to make sure that we are not sharing misinformation. We don't want to have incorrect information in our lab work, our schoolwork. We don't want to have incorrect information at work, but we also don't want to have incorrect information in general. You don't want to be spreading things that aren't true to people that you know in real life either. We also want to make sure that the conclusions we have are accurate. If we don't have good information coming in, we are not going to be able to make correct conclusions from our information. We have to make sure that the data is supporting the conclusion that we have. Now, this can actually be a real problem when we start talking about things like propaganda. For example, climate change. So, with climate change, one of the things that happens is this can actually turn into a surprisingly political topic, but this can also be a really good example of where sources are maybe not vetted as well as they could be. And what I mean by that is if we have a news report that's saying something like, for example, scientists argue about climate change. Well, that might be true. The part that we're not seeing is that out of 100 scientists, 99 might say, yes, I agree, climate change is here. And one might say, oh, I don't know about that, or I disagree. And so, technically, yes, scientists are disagreeing about climate change. But if we look at the ratio of 99 to 1, then we might end up reaching a different conclusion. So we might look at it and say, oh, well, but if 99 scientists out of 100 are saying climate change is here, then maybe we want to look at our own conclusions and say, oh, maybe this is something I should be concerned about. One of the problems that we have now, and I hate to say it like this, but nowadays, is anybody can say anything on the internet. You know, a really long time ago, one of the things that actually used to happen is the only way for information to be shared was through things like newspapers and news broadcasts. And this was actually a big problem in history because if you're only getting your information that's been approved by newspapers or newscasters, you're not actually necessarily getting the full picture of information. The information that they have might be vetted as accurate or technically accurate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the most trustworthy, perfect part of the information shared. Whereas now, literally anybody can go on the internet and say anything. They don't have to have proof, they don't have to have qualifications, they don't have to have data. If you don't believe me, go on social media. You know, if you look at any of the Facebook postings, TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever, you can see that anybody can share anything. Anybody can say they're anyone. And even now we're having problems with it's not even a person saying it, it's somebody created an AI to say it. And so they have a video that's actually an AI, or a picture that's actually an AI, or a quote that was actually written by an AI. And so all of that is really mushing together to make this really confusing area of information that we have to deal with in a way that, maybe if you're a little bit older, you didn't have to deal with as a kid, or your parents didn't have to deal with, because, if they were looking at the evening news with Walter Cronkite, we were able to watch him and say like, oh, well, he's trustworthy and he's giving us information, and that was the only information we had. Whereas now you can go find 50 different sources in a whole variety of different ways to be able to see, oh, well, maybe there's this perspective. Do I need to consider this perspective? Do I need to consider that perspective? That kind of thing. Now, the reason that it's important that we want to use good sources, one of the issues, again, with anybody can post anything, is the people that are posting information don't necessarily verify the information. And this is actually a huge issue where people will say, oh, I heard about, but they don't remember where they heard about it. So they might treat a newspaper or the Associated Press or a news broadcast as the same thing as, oh, this person on social media said. And we know that those aren't necessarily equivalent statements. Some crank on Facebook said this is not the same thing as the Associated Press has put out a statement that says this. So we want to make sure that the data is being analyzed by somebody that actually knows what they're doing and has some insight into this. We want to make sure that the data and the conclusions are being verified by more than one person. One of the things that happens in science is we don't just say, well, I've done this thing, trust me, you can't replicate it. It's, I've done this thing, this is how I've done this thing, you can replicate it by doing these set of instructions so that you can see for yourself that what I'm doing is true or is accurate, or this theory that I have, I would like to engage you with this theory so that you can try it yourself and say, did this work? Did this not work? Is this an accurate theory? So those are all important reasons that we want to make sure that we are paying attention to and having good sources. We also want to make sure that the source is reputable. So one of the issues that's been happening is a lot of places and companies have been sending out information, and it's not even necessarily that they aren't verifying it, it's that they have an agenda. And that agenda could be anything as sort of innocuous as just trying to sell you something and being obvious about it, or trying to sort of lead you in a particular direction. So, one of the things that happens is a lot of companies will actually publish information and papers and blog posts, but that doesn't necessarily show what's going on in the world. They're just trying to showcase a product or get you to pay money for something. And so you don't necessarily want to use that as a source of, oh, this particular issue X is an issue in the world because, this person is trying to get me to spend money on it. It's X is an issue because of, and is it, sort of outside of that. The other problem that we do have to run into is some journals and publications are what they call pay to play. And it's not that they're actually verifying things, it's that if you pay them enough money, they will put you out there. So there's some examples of this where you might be getting things in the mail or things in your email that says, oh, well, with a $200 membership, we'll put you on the list of, 25 under 25, like that type of thing. And it's not that you did anything, it's that they would like your money and then they'll put you on the list. And that's not how we want to evaluate our sources. We don't want whoever has the most money to be able to tell us what's going on. We want actually accurate information. We want to make sure that the work was done by experts in the field. We don't want just, again, some crank on Facebook that decided they wanted to say something with, no proof, no backup, no sources, that kind of thing. Now, there is a difference between different ways of getting sources. So, when you are doing research, and this is true for anything, this is true for research papers, this is true for asking for help with a lab, this is true for even just, hey, I wonder about. And the sort of main ways that a lot of people end up looking for resources or sources to be able to form opinions is they look at AI, search engines, and research databases. Now, AI is actually kind of a tricky one now because AI is getting put into so many different places. You may not even realize it. So it used to be when you would do a search on, say, like, Google or Yahoo or Ask Jeeves or Lycos or whatever it happened to be, it would have an algorithm that would give you information. Quite a while ago, like, 30 years ago, what we actually used to use was keywords. And so it would look through the keywords of the site and give recommendations based off of the keywords. It's gotten a lot more sophisticated with the advent of Google and the way Google did their algorithm. That really changed how search engines work. I wouldn't say overnight. I'd say it probably took like a year or so before everybody kind of switched over because the results that you would get would be more relevant to what you wanted or you think you wanted. But search engines don't check accuracy. So they give you results based off of what they think you want or they think you mean. They're not going to check, hey, is this an accurate source? Has this been vetted? Has anybody checked this? AI is actually sort of similar in that it's only as good as its sources. It's only as good as the training models. There's no checks, there's no oversight, there's nothing. It's just whatever's getting put in there is what's coming out. It's not checking relevance. It's not checking accuracy. There's nobody that's looking at it saying, oh, yes, this is a completely accurate statement that it's making. It's literally just saying, I have taken all of these sources, mooshed them together, and given you something back for it. So it doesn't even necessarily give you anything reasonable. It could give you word salad and it wouldn't know the difference. So that can be a real problem if you're trying to look at it and say, is this something I should believe? Is this something I should rely on? Research databases, mostly you end up accessing through a library or the library website. And the good thing about those is they've been checked, they've been peer reviewed. You do still have to be careful of pay to play, but it's less of a problem. And so you can look at all of these, papers and stuff and say, these are sources that have been checked. They have been verified. Experts have said, yes, we agree. This is good to publish. Or this is a look at all of the research that's already been done. The problem is they can be harder to use than AI and search engines. You have to take some extra steps to use them, and they're also not going to cover things that is going to be necessarily as relevant because research can sometimes lag behind because of the way publications work is things are only published after they've been reviewed by peers, which means you have to do your research, you have to write up the paper, you have to send that paper to journals, journals have to send that paper to reviewers, reviewers have to give feedback on the paper, and then the journal can decide if it's going to accept the paper or not and publish it. So that means it's not, hey, I had this idea at 2 in the morning, let's share. It's, hey, I had this idea, I did all of this work, 6 months or a year later, I can publish my paper for it. Whereas for search engines and AI, they're going to be able to search through anything and everything people have published publicly on the internet. So, rando at 2 a.m. can post something on Reddit and it will show up in a search engine or it can show up as part of an AI trainer. And so it might be a little bit more current, but it also may not be as trustworthy because rando on Reddit. If you don't know what Reddit is, it's a forum where people will go to discuss things, and I would say there is technically oversight in mods. I'm not sure I would necessarily say that the oversight is going to be accuracy checking in all cases. Okay, so AI sources. AI actually doesn't learn, it's trained. So the way that AI works is you get bunches and bunches of data. That data is fed into basically an algorithm. And then that algorithm will make some inferences based off of the data. So let's say I'm reviewing a book And so it's not going to just take in my review, it's going to take in my review, 50 other reviews, and excerpts from the book, and then look for things like commonalities. Is there words all of the reviewers had? Happy ending, sad ending, is there phrases that all of the reviewers had? Are there phrases that it sees in the excerpt of the book? And then it will spit back, many reviewers have said this book has a happy ending. Many reviewers have said this book is really tragic, that kind of thing. And so the AI isn't learning, it's just looking at all of the data and seeing patterns in the data and then sharing what those patterns are. Training is done by giving it anything, literally anything the creators can get their hands on. That does not mean that it's always reputable. There's actually been some huge problems with how AI has been trained. There's actually a lawsuit because AI was trained using books, but those authors of those books were not compensated. The AI was given these pirated books. And, there is some argument, well, who pirated it? Who gave it to the training model? How much should we actually check training models? Because a training model isn't 50 pieces of data or 100 pieces of data, it could be a million pieces of data. So, that lawsuit about pirated books going into the AI, they're yes, it's more data. Yes, it's been trained on more things, but would we consider that sort of an ethical use of it? Or artists. An artist has created some of their art, put it out on the internet, put it out on social media. The AI can look at that art and then generate pictures that look similar based off of things like colors and clusters of pixels and things like that. But that artist didn't necessarily give permission for the AI to train on that art, but the AI is doing it anyway. AI can also do things like pull pictures from social media. So if you have publicly available pictures, that can actually get added to AI trainings. There's been a lot of issues with how AIs are trained. So another example of this is actually anatomy studies. This was relatively recent in the news, where the problem was AIs were taking all of these anatomy A&P textbooks and using that as training models, but it wasn't necessarily splitting things up because of some bias that's in the books, because medical testing actually up until the mid 90s, mid 2000s, kind of still continuing, is mostly focused on people that have male anatomy and people who identify as men. So a lot of the A&P books had that focus. So what happened with the AI is it was actually spitting back out information, but it wasn't necessarily separating the male and female information. So, like, there was a picture that came out and it was supposed to be like a cross section of a person, but they basically kind of mooshed together some of the anatomy. If you know what I'm saying. And then it was saying, how this is what everybody looks like. And it's like, well, but no. So AI isn't able to recognize that, though. It can't look at it and say, oh, I'm saying something that's silly. We actually call it hallucinations, where AI is saying something that like makes no sense to us, but for the AI it makes perfect sense. Another issue with AI is people are using it without realizing that they're using it. AI has been getting baked into so many different things. Like even Google searches will show you AI results at the top before it will give you links. Again, not checked, just patterns. There's actually an example in the news of a lawyer that used an AI for arguments, and AI actually cited fake court cases. And it went through and it said, oh, yes, well, your arguments are valid because of this court case. Except that was a court case that never happened. It just took patterns from other court cases that it saw, mooshed some things together, and called it good. And then when the lawyer ended up using and citing those court cases that didn't exist, all of his arguments fell apart because there was no court case for them to actually reference. So that's some of the things that we have to worry about with using AI as a source is it cannot be a primary source. You can ask it something, but you have to recognize its limitations and make sure you're verifying the information that AI is giving you. Make sure that you're checking into the sources it's using. Did it actually say what it thinks it's saying? Search engines go over what's available on the internet. So it's not recognizing patterns the way that AI does. What a search engine will do is use an algorithm to give you links that it thinks are relevant, and it will give you links in an order that it thinks you will like. Now, this has actually changed drastically. So, the simple keyword searches would give us all kinds of things that were super not relevant. But now it's gotten to the point where it is technically more relevant, but it's sort of gone down this almost odd rabbit hole of it's so relevant and so tailored to you, it's not really giving you an unbiased perspective. A lot of search engines will say, well, they've clicked on these links in the past, or their, group or their demographic has clicked on these links in the past, so these are the links I'm going to share, regardless of if it's the most accurate information or the most up to date information, or if this information has actually been used in any way. It can also have things like SEO, search engine optimization, where sites will pay money to get people to consult for them so that they're higher in the listings. A good example of this: if you or someone you know has any food allergies or food restrictions, you have probably at some point in your life tried to go search for a particular food grouping on, let's say, Google. If you haven't, go try it. And one of the things that will happen is it will make suggestions where, if you sort of, an example of this is like vegan versus vegetarian. So, vegetarian means that people don't usually eat meat. They might eat fish, pescatarian, but they don't eat meat. Vegan means that they generally won't eat animal products. That will include things like, cheese, milk products, eggs, stuff like that. So you can see where those are not the same. But if you go search for vegetarian restaurants in your area and then vegan restaurants in your area, what you'll actually see is that the search engine doesn't necessarily look between them. It just says, oh, close enough, whatever. But you can see that's not actually close enough. And then if you look at what you're actually being given in the results, you see that you're going to get things like, TripAdvisor, Yelp, stuff like that, where it's, oh, the 10 most popular vegan restaurants around you, the 10 most popular vegetarian restaurants around you. And unless you live in a big city, there are not 10 vegetarian or vegan restaurants that are around you. Let me assure you. At best, they might have one thing on the menu. So, but that doesn't stop the links from saying that. That doesn't stop Google from serving those links to you. It doesn't stop that from being on the first page. And one of the things you have to ask yourself when you're looking at search engines: when was the last time you went past the first page? When was the last time you said, oh, I'm going to go look at the next page instead of just saying, oh, this is junk, I'm going to redo my search? So if you think about this as a source accuracy issue, it's serving you things that are not necessarily accurate. It's going to show you things that it thinks you want, which is not the same thing. That, sort of confirmation bias to agree with you, or confirmation bias to not agree with you because you're interacting with things that make you mad. So, really commonly, if you interact with things that, clickbait or rage bait or anything like that, that's what it's going to show you more of. And you'll see this in social media as well. But this ends up being relevant for our sources, because if you are interacting with different things, that's what you're going to see more of. And so that's what your sources are going to be sort of biased towards if this is how you're getting most of your information. If you've already decided something, like, let's say, the earth is flat. Now, before you come at me and say, like, well, that's ridiculous, but Flat Earth Society, you can go Google it. So let's say for a minute you have decided the earth is flat. You're convinced of it. At some point, if you start asking AI about this, you could get AI to agree with you. Oh, yeah, the earth totally flat. You could get search engines that are going to give you back all kinds of results that are going to be all about how the earth is flat. Now, that doesn't change the fact that the earth isn't flat. It's just showing you all of these sources that are going to say, like, oh, yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's not always the same thing. So that's why it's really important to think about like the media that you're consuming, the results that you're looking at, and how these results are getting to you to evaluate, is this accurate data? And unfortunately, we can't just say, like, oh, well, nobody says this because Flat Earth Society, there's quite a few people that will very seriously tell you the Earth is flat. And more than one person. It's not like there's just one person out there. There are multiple people out there that will come and very seriously tell you that the Earth is flat and argue with you that the Earth is flat. And so you can't just say, oh, well, nobody agrees with that, so it's not accurate. You have to go and actually look at how they're making this decision, the results that they're showing you, the data that they're looking at to say, like, oh, but does this make sense? Are these conclusions agreed with? Do other people outside of this think the earth is flat? How did scientists decide that the earth wasn't flat? Was it scientists? Who figured that out? How did they decide? Is this something I could see for myself? How do I understand how this information is coming to me? And so all of that is actually really important for how we go about looking at our sources. Now, academic databases and news sources. So, academic databases should be peer reviewed, they should be checked. Anybody cannot just post to an academic database. You have to have published papers, they have to be peer reviewed, by which I mean other people who are in your industry should look at your paper, go through the conclusions, and make sure, yeah, this makes sense, I agree. The community that you are in, the community of experts, should decide if the source and data is reputable. So that means if you tried to, for example, publish a paper about how the earth is flat and it went to a bunch of scientists, you would have to then argue with those scientists about why the conclusions that you've drawn are accurate. So it gives a little bit more truth to what is actually being published. So academic databases can be seen as more accurate because more people have sort of agreed, based on what we know now, based on the data and research we have now, these are the most logical conclusions we can make with what we know. Other people in the community can look at it and say, like, okay, yeah, this is, for what we know, this is the best we can guess. The big problem with these academic databases, they're not going to cover anything. There's actually huge gaps of things that are not covered. There's huge gaps of things that haven't been researched, haven't been asked, haven't been looked at. And besides that, searching through these databases can actually be really difficult. Trying to find what you want and read through all of these different papers can be difficult. Now, if we're talking about this for lab work or a research paper, this can be one of the best ways to get sources because it's already been verified. So doing source evaluation on these will be considerably easier than other places. But if you're trying to look at something that's sort of like up to date or a hot topic or one of the big gaps in the research, you're going to have a problem. For example, if you're in tech and you're doing things with, say, containers, containers are a new enough technology that there isn't necessarily going to be as much research into them as you might want. And let's say you're trying to do something like troubleshooting containers because the containers have blown up in your face. The research papers are not necessarily going to be able to help you with that. You have to go to other sources. So a research paper might be able to tell you how the container is put together, but it is probably not going to be able to tell you how to fix the specific problem you're having with your container and the machine you have it on. You are going to have to go to search engines, AI, stuff like that, to be able to get that information. So they all have limitations, but they also can have potential bonuses. The crank at 2 a.m., maybe they're posting how to fix containers and they've come up with a brilliant solution on Kubernetes and they were only up until 2 a.m. because Kubernetes decided that it hated them until 1:30. Like, I would know nothing about that from experience. So that kind of thing that you want to look at these academic databases and look at these news sources, it makes it easier to evaluate the actual source and make sure that it's accurate. But just remember, there are going to be some limitations to that as well. Now, when we're talking about news sources and how we get news, we also have to think about the bias that's coming with that. One of the problems that we have with sources is sources have bias. Everybody has bias. So, if we are looking at how we are getting our information, who is giving us this information matters because that is going to sort of try to guide us in a particular way. So, a media bias chart, this is more US based than anything else. If you live other places in the world, you will have different media that is going to be giving you information. But you can see that there's actually like sort of left and whoof left, sort of right and whoof right. And then we have the sort of midway of what is considered center. Now, people are going to disagree with this, and that's okay. Maybe there is something on here where you're like, oh, actually, I get all of my news from here. But what I'd like you to think about is, why do you get all of your news from there? Why are you not looking at other places? Why are you not thinking about other sources of information? And that's true almost wherever you are. Like if you're getting all of your news from, say, the Wall Street Journal or Newsweek, what are you missing? What are you not seeing? What data isn't being published? Because, yeah, okay, cool, it's more of a center source, but what is happening that the center is maybe not seeing? So, are there things happening in the world that aren't being published on the center set of, news? And then we have to think about, why isn't it being published on there? And how much do we trust where it is being published? If it's being published by somewhere that says, for entertainment only, maybe we don't want to look at it as a news source. Like, do I, think that it's a good idea to go to, say, like The Onion and then treat it as news? No, I don't. Like, that's not its purpose. It's entertainment. And there are several things on this chart that I would look at and say, no, that's not news. That is entertainment. And if you want to be entertained, cool, I guess. But make sure that you're actually looking at what's being written and who is writing it and where they're getting their data from so that you can evaluate, is this actually accurate? Is this, hiding something that it shouldn't be hiding? And I would say that because all of these places will have some variety of bias in some way, it is more important that you know what the bias is so that you can take that into account. And that's true wherever we're looking on this chart. Bias matters because everybody has an agenda. Some agendas are more obvious. The further towards the ends of the chart you get, the agenda tends to be a little bit more obvious, but in the center of the chart, you may not see the agenda. It's still there, but you may not see it as clearly. Everybody also has internal biases. You don't necessarily think you do, you might not necessarily see them, but everybody has something. Bias can affect anything from the way that we share things to the vocabulary that we use to where we are looking for our information. So, an example that I'll use for this is in journalism, there's something called the passive voice. Journalists will talk about people who have been victimized, and children. And they will sometimes use the passive voice in this. So something happened to them. So, something sadly happened to this victim instead of, this person attacked that person. And even that type of language can actually affect how you end up reading the article, how you end up taking the data, how you end up looking at the source. You can actually go look this up and see about the different voices in journalism, the different types of bias, and sort of how that ends up actually affecting, sort of culturally, how things are seen. So you can actually see that basically anywhere in the world. And so it ends up mattering because once you start to see things like that bias, it can change how you see the data that is being shared. And then you can start saying, okay, but like, what might I be missing from this data? And then you want to say, like, okay, well, if I feel like I'm missing some of this data or some of this analysis, now I can look at who's doing this analysis. Do they know what they're doing? Are they using good data? Are they using good techniques? If the answer is no, then you have to ask yourself, hey, where can I go to get better information? Bias is also an issue with a hot topic. The larger the stakes, the more people are inclined to lie. And again, not to get political, but you can see this in politics all the time. The more sort of contentious something is, the more people are more likely to lie about what's happening because they have a specific agenda they are trying to push. There are a lot of different types of bias. There's confirmation bias, where people will end up only seeing or looking at the things that they agree with. There's demographic bias, where they're only looking at the people that, have a particular demographic as them, whether that's a, ethnicity, a race, a gender, a skin color, a place in the world that they live, a place in the United States that they live. There's also distance bias. Somebody is going to care more about something that happens close to home than across the world. And all of those different types of bias end up existing, and the more that you sort of know and can recognize them, the more you'll be able to look at your sources and have a better view of your sources. So an example of this, and I kind of hate to, I don't want to say pick on the older people, but like kind of. One of the things that's happened, especially with the, boomer generation, is people have been writing articles from the perspective of the boomer generation and going, oh, those dang kids. And so it's been, all those dang millennials. And, what have millennials killed now? So you can see there's actually an entire list of things millennials have killed. Millennials have killed the diamond trade, beer, handshakes, darn those kids. But like, is that actually like what's happening? And if you go through and look at this, if you are a millennial, you might have a different reaction than if you are in the boomer generation, or if you're in the Gen Z generation, you might have a different reaction to this. And so that bias will end up affecting the source because you'll read it with sort of a different set of eyes, taking the information differently. And so knowing all of that means that you can recognize better what's a reasonable source and what isn't. Now, how we evaluate sources. So, whenever we are looking at something and sort of taking the information in and figuring out, do we want to, say, believe or trust, and how much do we want to believe or trust? One of the ways we can do this is called a crap test. Now, there are other ways to do this. This is just sort of a quick and easy one. And what the crap test is going to do is look at currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And so this can give you a really quick look at the source and say, does this work? So like, let's say I'm looking at an academic paper. Well, current, maybe not. Academic papers could be from the 70s. It could depend. Has it been revised or updated? Is somebody keeping up to date with this? Is it actually related to the topic? Probably. Is it current? I mean, maybe in the last year. Is it authoritative? Probably because it's already been vetted and peer reviewed. Is it accurate? Yeah, because it's going to be as accurate as possible because it's been vetted, it's been peer reviewed, it's gone through, all kinds of people looking at it saying, like, yeah, we've checked the spelling, we've checked the facts, we've checked the data. And then the purpose is also a lot more clear because the information has been created by some variety of expert in the field. There was probably some kind of a bias, but that's probably not selling you anything. Whereas, like, let's say we look at a TikTok video. Is it current? Yeah, probably. You're only looking at current TikToks. It's been updated real fast. Is it relevant? Honestly, probably very relevant because the algorithm is going to serve up information that is pretty close to what you're looking for. Is it authoritative? Now, that's where it can get more tricky because anybody can post anything. For anybody that doesn't know TikTok, it's like a short form social media where it's just like these quick videos, and like literally anybody can post anything. There can be academics on there trying to share their thesis. There can be the PhD dance competition. There's also going to be trends, and anybody with a phone can post, which is anybody basically 13 and up. um and, like, no offense if you are 13, but I do not necessarily think that 13-year-olds should be used as a yardstick of knowledge about anything other than what it's like to be 13, because at that point in time, they haven't sort of learned enough to necessarily figure out what's going on, and they're focused on other things. Um, you know, Probably food, actually, if they're 13. So, like, for TikTok, is it accurate? Who knows? Somebody has posted. That's all you can say. You don't know accuracy. You just know somebody has said something. Are there errors? Probably. I mean, if you've ever read any of the captions in any social media, you might be horrified. Or not. Maybe that's just an old people thing, and I look at it and go, oh, the Oxford comma. Maybe other people don't have that reaction. What's the purpose? That also gets a lot more muddied when we start looking at things like TikTok videos, because in a lot of cases, the purpose, sell ads. And that could be an ad generated by something like, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. That could be an ad based off of the person that's, shilling a thing. It could be that they're getting paid to shill the thing. The purpose can be they likes the money. So you can see where that's sort of an opposite to the academic paper, where, current and relevant might be a little bit more questionable, but authoritative, accurate, purpose, much more true for the academic papers than, rando TikTok. So when we're looking at our sources, we have to be able to go through and ask ourselves these questions about them so that we can make sure that we are using them appropriately. If you're doing a research paper, and there's not a lot of cases where, citing rando from TikTok or Reddit is going to make a lot of sense. But if you're trying to do troubleshooting, maybe, it does make sense. Maybe you go to Stack Overflow. And so then you can cite that and say, well, I've gone through the crap test. This is the answers to these questions. And I found this to be accurate because it helps me do my troubleshooting. So these are all the things that we need to look at as we are evaluating sources, and make sure that we are asking ourselves, questioning ourselves about the data that we're seeing, the data that we're reading, the conclusions that have been drawn from this data, and make sure that we are doing the best that we can to have the most accurate information that we can, especially if we're going to be sharing it with others. So, thank you very much for joining. And if you have any questions or concerns, always please reach out and you can ask them. And I hope everybody has a lovely day.